The trunk was half full when Simon Fairchild appeared in the doorway. Bessie Reed did not look up. She pressed a folded dress into the cedar-lined interior of the trunk with both palms, smoothing the fabric as though she had all the time in the world, as though her heart was not hammering so hard against her ribs that she could hear it in her own ears. The late afternoon sun came through the single window of the small room above the Dusty Creek General Store and laid a bar of amber light across the floorboards between them. She could see his boots in it, scuffed brown leather, the left sole coming loose at the toe. She knew those boots as well as she knew her own hands. He said nothing. She folded another dress, a white one with small blue flowers at the collar, the kind she had worn the first Sunday she ever sat beside him in the Dusty Creek church, back when everything between them had been possibility and promise instead of this terrible, suffocating silence. "Train leaves at 7 tomorrow morning," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was proud of that, in the way a person is proud of small acts of survival. Simon Fairchild leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. She could feel his eyes on her back, feel the weight of everything he was not saying pressing into the room like a physical presence. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean-waisted, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples when the weather was humid and hands that had built 3 structures in this town with no more tools than determination and a good square. He was the most stubborn man Bessie Reed had ever encountered in all of her 27 years, and she had grown up in a house full of stubborn men. "I heard," he said. That was all. Those 2 words. A wall built out of nothing but breath. Bessie set a pair of kidskin gloves on top of the dress. She had purchased those gloves from old Mrs. Hartwell's shop on the day she first arrived in Dusty Creek, Nebraska, in the spring of 1882. She had been 24 years old, alone, and carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. Simon Fairchild had been the man sent to collect her from the depot, though she had not known at the time that sending him was Mrs. Alvarez's idea of a joke, pairing the most unsociable man in Comanche County with the most forthright woman to ever step off a Union Pacific train. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she began to fold a second pair of gloves. He was not going to ask her to stay. She had known this about him for months, had known it the way you know a weather front is coming before the clouds arrive, a pressure change in the air, a particular quality of stillness. Simon Fairchild's pride was not a small or simple thing. It had been built over years of necessity, mortared together with every loss he had ever refused to grieve in public, every wound he had refused to name. And now, standing in her doorway with 3 years of shared history between them and a train ticket sitting on the washstand in plain sight, his pride was going to let her walk out of this town and out of his life without a single word of protest, unless she packed slowly enough. Unless she gave him enough time to find the words buried underneath all that armor. She reached for the photograph. It sat on the small shelf above the washstand, a cabinet card in a simple wooden frame. It had been taken the previous autumn at the county fair in Hartwell Junction. In it, Simon stood beside Bessie with his hat in his hands, and his expression caught in something that was almost a smile, the kind of expression a man wears when he has decided to be happy but is not quite sure he deserves it. Bessie was laughing at something out of frame, her head tilted back slightly, and the angle of the light made her dark hair look like polished mahogany. She had never liked photographs of herself. She thought she looked ordinary in them, round-faced and plain. But she had loved this one because of him, because of what his face was doing when he did not know anyone was watching. She set the photograph on the edge of the trunk but did not put it inside. Not yet. Behind her, she heard him push off the doorframe and take one step into the room. The floorboard that she had asked him 3 times to fix gave its familiar complaint under his weight. "Bessie," he said. She turned around. The look on his face broke something in her chest that she had been trying very hard to keep intact. He was not a man who showed himself easily. She had learned that over 3 years of close proximity, of working alongside him on the practical machinery of this small town's daily life, of being the woman everyone in Dusty Creek treated as the obvious eventual companion to Simon Fairchild without either of them ever making it official, without either of them ever naming the thing that lived between them like a warm coal in the center of a winter room. He did not show himself easily, but he was showing himself now, and it was devastating. His jaw was tight. His dark eyes were doing something complicated and wounded. His hands, those capable, calloused hands, were at his sides with the fingers slightly curled, as though he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "The train," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "The train," he said again, and his voice had gone rough, "leaves at 7. "Yes," she said, "I just told you that." "I know." He looked at the trunk. He looked at the photograph balanced on its edge. He looked at the gloves. He looked at everything in the room except her face. "I know you did." Bessie Reed had grown up in Hays, Kansas, the second daughter of a railroad surveyor who was away 6 months out of every 12, and a mother who had raised 4 children on determination and black coffee, and the particular grace of women who learn early that no one is coming to make things easier. She had worked as a school teacher in Hays for 2 years, had come to Dusty Creek because the school board was paying $20 a month more than the one back home, and because she had needed desperately to see something new. She had not come looking for Simon Fairchild. She had not come looking for anyone, but the heart has its own agenda. She had fallen for him somewhere between the 2nd month and the 6th, somewhere in the accumulation of mornings when he showed up at the schoolhouse to fix things without being asked, and afternoons when she found small, useful things left on her porch: a cord of firewood, a jar of good honey from old Elia's Cutter's bees, once a book of poetry that he had acquired from the traveling bookseller, and left with no note and no explanation except that she had mentioned, once, in passing, that she had read Tennyson as a girl and wished she still had her copy. He never claimed any of those gestures, never asked for credit. And when she thanked him, he always found somewhere else to look and said something dismissive and moved on. That was Simon Fairchild. He spoke in actions and fell silent at the crucial moment. She had waited for 3 years. She was done waiting, or rather, she was waiting differently now. She was waiting with her hands moving and her trunk filling, and she was giving him exactly this much time to say what needed to be said. Because she had come to understand something about him in 3 years of study, the words were there. They were always there. They simply needed a reason to surface, and that reason for a man like Simon was not patience and tenderness and open arms. It was consequence. It was the sight of the thing he would lose becoming real. So she packed slowly, and she waited. 3 years earlier, on a morning in April of 1882, the Union Pacific train had deposited Bessie Reed on the platform at Dusty Creek with a carpetbag, a trunk, and a very firm jaw. The town of Dusty Creek sat in the low roll of the Nebraska panhandle like something that had been set down in a hurry and never quite straightened up. It had a main street of 8 buildings, a church, a school that was also used for town meetings on weeks when school was not in session, a stable, a general store owned by a widow named Mrs. Hartwell, a land office, a saloon called the Copper Nail that did moderate business, and a collection of residential structures ranging from sound to optimistic. It also had, in a manner of speaking, Simon Fairchild. He had been leaning against the depot wall when she stepped off the train, arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested he had better things to do and was not entirely sure why he had agreed to this particular errand. He was dark and angular and slightly weather-beaten in the way that men who spend significant portions of their lives outdoors tend to be, and when he saw her, he straightened up with the reluctant courtesy of a man who had been raised by someone who would not tolerate rudeness, even when rudeness was his preference. "Miss Reed," he said. It was not a question. "That is correct," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it with a brief, businesslike grip and looked at her trunk. "That going to the store?" "I am boarding above the general store, yes. Mrs. Hartwell was kind enough to arrange it. I know, I built the room." He picked up her trunk with what appeared to be no effort at all, which told her something about his strength that she filed away without particularly meaning to. This way. She followed him up the main street of Dusty Creek in the April sunshine, and she took careful note of everything. The state of the buildings, the condition of the street, the faces of the few people who were outside and who watched her with the frank curiosity of small-town inhabitants, and the set of this man's shoulders ahead of her, which communicated something she could not yet translate. "Are you the welcoming committee?" She asked because she was curious and because she had found that asking direct questions was usually more efficient than waiting for information to arrive. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Mrs. Alvarez thought you should have somebody to collect you, and Mrs. Alvarez sent you specifically." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, slightly longer. "I was available." She had the strong impression that this was not the whole truth, but she filed it away as well and said nothing more until they reached the general store. She came to understand, over the following weeks, the shape of the town she had arrived in. Dusty Creek was a community in the particular middle period of a settlement's life, past the raw early days when survival was the primary occupation, but not yet established enough to feel permanent. The school had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they arrived every morning, with the ranging needs and energies of children being raised in a hard country, and Bessie Reed threw herself into teaching them with the full force of her considerable competence. She also began, with no particular plan, to understand Simon Fairchild. He was everywhere in the practical life of Dusty Creek in the way that certain people in small communities become load-bearing walls without anyone quite deciding that this is their function. He built things. He fixed things. He transported things and people when transport was needed. He sat on the small town council and said very little but always voted carefully. He was not the mayor. That was an amiable man named George Pickett who ran the land office, and he was not a lawman or a merchant. He was simply a man who had come to Dusty Creek 4 years before Bessie's arrival, had built himself a claim 2 miles east of town on a piece of land that was not the most promising in the county, but that he had proceeded to make productive through a combination of good instinct and extraordinary stubbornness, and who had, in the way of capable, reliable people, become essential. He had no family that anyone mentioned. When Bessie, in the careful social excavations of her first weeks, asked Mrs. Hartwell about him, the older woman had given her a measuring look and said that Simon Fairchild had come out of Missouri under circumstances that were not entirely clear, and that he kept his past where most men in this country kept theirs, behind them and unspoken. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hartwell had said, in the tone of a woman who meant this as the entire and sufficient summary. "But he is not an easy one." Bessie had understood that. She had not yet understood how much it would matter to her. The first time she had a real conversation with him, not the transactional exchanges of early acquaintance but something genuine and sustained, was in June of that first year, 6 weeks after her arrival. The school term had ended for the summer, and she had taken to spending her evenings on the small porch above the store, reading when the light was good and watching the street when it was not. He came by on a Thursday evening with a set of repairs to make on the store's back step, repairs that could have been done at any time of day, but that he had apparently scheduled for the hour before sunset, and they had ended up talking for 2 hours while the sky went from blue to gold to the particular deep bruised purple of a Nebraska summer evening. She no longer remembered exactly what they had talked about. She remembered the quality of it. She remembered that it had surprised her, the way he talked when he was not guarding himself, which was apparently something he did when he had his hands occupied with work and was not looking at her directly. She remembered thinking that there were 2 Simon Fairchilds, the one who faced you head-on and showed you almost nothing, and the one who appeared in your peripheral vision and was, startlingly, dangerously alive. By the end of that first summer, she had stopped pretending to herself that she was unaffected by him. By the second autumn, the whole town of Dusty Creek had apparently decided that the schoolteacher and the builder were moving steadily toward a conclusion, despite the lack of any official declaration on either side. Mrs. Hartwell gave Bessie knowing looks. Reverend Oakes made small, pointed remarks about the blessings of companionship. Even the children in her class displayed the unerring social intelligence of children in small towns, which is to say that they noticed everything and repeated most of it. Simon himself moved through all of this with the steadiness of a man who had decided not to notice. He appeared at her door on a Saturday in October of 1883, the second autumn, with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression that she was learning to read as controlled nervousness, which in him manifested as an additional layer of stillness rather than the agitation it would have produced in most people. "There is a dance," he said, "at Hartwell Junction, 3 weeks from this Saturday." He held out the paper. It was a printed notice. "I thought you might want to go." She had taken the paper and looked at it for a moment, partly to give him time and partly because she was composing herself, and then she had said, "Are you asking me to accompany you?" "If you wanted to," he said. "It is a reasonable distance. I have a wagon." "Simon," she had said, because she had been calling him by his first name since August despite his initial preference for formality, "that is the least romantic invitation I have ever received." The corner of his mouth had done something that was not quite a smile. "I will work on it." "You do that," she had said, and taken the notice inside, and stood in the middle of her small room with her hand pressed to her sternum and her eyes closed, because the unsmile, the half-joke, the brief crack in his armor had done more to her composure than a formally spoken declaration from any other man she had ever known. They had gone to the dance at Hartwell Junction. He had been a better dancer than she expected. At some point in the middle of the second waltz, when the lamplight was warm and the fiddle was doing something sweet and plaintive, she had looked up at him and found him already looking down at her, with an expression that he did not immediately replace with neutrality. And for approximately 4 seconds they had simply looked at each other, and the thing between them had been as plain and enormous as a thunderhead. Then the song had ended, and he had stepped back with a small, correct nod and gone to get her a cup of punch. That was what she was dealing with. That was the shape of it. By the third year, by the spring and summer of 1884, something had shifted in the architecture of their daily life together, though nothing had been spoken. He came to supper on Sunday evenings as a matter of course, and she had stopped asking why he had shown up at the schoolhouse and simply made space for him when he appeared. The townspeople had stopped speculating about them and had moved on to treating their apparent partnership as an established fact, which meant that Bessie got the same kind of small, companionable social recognition that married women received, without any of the formal arrangements. She had thought in the spring of 1884 that this year would be the year he said something. She had thought that the accumulation of evidence was sufficient. 3 years of every available signal she could send without outright declaration. 3 years of showing him that she was not going anywhere, was not frightened of the work or the isolation or the hard country, was not going to disappear on him the way that something in his dark, kept past had apparently taught him people did. But summer came and went and he said nothing. And then, in September, she received a letter from her sister Clara in Hayes. Clara's letter was long and affectionate and full of news, and buried in the middle of it, almost casual, was the information that the school board in Hayes was looking for a teacher for the fall term, that the previous teacher had married and moved to Omaha, that the salary was substantially more than what Bessie was earning in Dusty Creek, and that Clara missed her sister very much and thought it would be wonderful to have her home. Bessie had read the letter twice. Then she had sat very still for a long time. She had written back to her sister and asked for the details. The details were good. The salary was better by $15 a month. Hayes had a proper school building with 2 rooms. She would be closer to her mother, who was not young and who had been unwell the previous winter. She had friends there, women she had grown up alongside, roots she had let go dry without quite meaning to. She had sat with the question for 3 weeks. She had watched Simon Fairchild come and go from her life with the practiced regularity of a man who had decided that what he had was enough, that the daily proximity was sufficient, that the warm coal between them could burn indefinitely without needing to be fed. She had written back to Clara and said yes. She had purchased a train ticket, the eastbound Union Pacific, 7 in the morning, October 14th, and she had not told Simon about it. She had told Mrs. Hartwell, because Mrs. Hartwell would need time to arrange a new boarder. She had told Reverend Oakes and the school board, because they would need a replacement teacher. She had told the children on a Friday afternoon in the second week of October, and several of them had cried, and it had cost her more than she had anticipated. She had not told Simon because she was waiting to see what he would do when he found out. She had not told Simon because she was testing something she was ashamed of testing, but could not stop herself from running. The experiment of the packed trunk and the train ticket, and the question of whether his pride, which was enormous and intractable, and had stood between them like a stone wall for 3 years, could be breached by the simple fact of her leaving. She had been in the room above the store for 4 days of packing, spreading it out, taking her time, keeping the trunk visible from the doorway, and word had gotten around the way word always got around in Dusty Creek, which was to say immediately and thoroughly. She had waited to see how long it would take him. It had taken 3 days for George Pickett to apparently say something to him, because on the afternoon of the 3rd day his wagon had appeared on the main street, and he had sat in it for a long, strange, visible moment before driving on without stopping. And now it was the 4th day, and he was in her doorway and saying her name with that wrecked quality in his voice, and looking at her trunk like it was something that had appeared without warning in the middle of his chest. She turned around and looked at him. "Simon," she said gently, because despite everything she had never wanted to wound him, "what is it you want to say to me?" He looked at the floor. He looked at the window. He moved one hand up to press against the back of his neck in the gesture she knew meant he was under duress. His jaw worked for a moment. "You should have told me," he said, "about the ticket." "Should I have?" She kept her voice even. "Why?" He looked at her then, finally, fully, and the thing in his eyes was so unguarded that she had to make a conscious effort not to cross the room to him. "You know why," he said. "I am not certain I do," she said. "You have never told me." The silence stretched. Outside, the main street of Dusty Creek made its late afternoon noises. A horse, a door, someone calling a name 2 buildings down. The light through the window had gone from amber to gold. In a little while it would be dark and the lamp would need lighting, and he would either still be standing in that doorway or he would not be. "I do not want you to go," he said. The words came out rough and slightly wrenched, as though they had been extracted under considerable pressure. "I do not want you to go, Bessie." She waited. "I have not," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I am not a man who—" He stopped again. He made a sound of frustration that was almost inaudible. Then he straightened his spine and looked at her with the particular focused quality he used when he was about to say something that mattered, and he said, "3 years ago I decided I was not going to let anyone mean something to me again. I decided it was safer not to." A pause. "I was wrong." She set down the folded blouse she had been holding without being aware of holding it. "You mean something to me," he said. "You mean—" His voice went very rough. "You are the whole shape of my days, Bessie. You have been since the 2nd month. I did not know how to say it, and I told myself that you knew it anyway, that you could see it, that I did not need to." He stopped. "I was too proud to ask you to stay. I know that. I know what I am." "What are you?" she said softly. "A fool," he said. Apparently, the corner of his mouth moved. "A fool who would very much like to ask you to stay, if you are willing." Bessie Reed looked at this man standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands and his pride laid out on the floor between them like something he had finally decided to step over, and she felt something in her chest expand to the size of the whole autumn sky. "That is still not a very romantic thing to say," she told him. "No," he agreed. "I know." He took 2 steps into the room, closing some of the distance between them, and his voice went quiet. "Bessie Reed, I am asking you, plain and direct, to stay in Dusty Creek. I am asking you to stay because I love you, and because I have been too proud and too afraid to say so for 3 years, and I would rather set my teeth and say it than watch you walk out of this town knowing I never did." The word love, said in Simon Fairchild's voice, with Simon Fairchild's particular roughness and gravity, was the most significant thing Bessie Reed had heard in her 27 years of life. She crossed the room. She put her hand against his jaw, his rough jaw with the day's growth of dark stubble, and she looked up at him and said, "I love you too. I have loved you since that first summer. I have been waiting for you to say so for 3 years. I am sorry it took so long," he said. "You are going to make it up to me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I intend to." And then, finally, with the late afternoon sun coming through the window and her trunk half-packed on the floor and the train ticket sitting on the washstand, Simon Fairchild bent his head and kissed Bessie Reed. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a kiss with 3 years of held-back feeling in it. 3 years of mornings when he had watched her cross the street and forced himself not to look too long. 3 years of Sunday suppers and autumn dances and small gestures left without notes, and everything he had never let himself say spoken now in the only language that had always come naturally to him, which was not words but action, warmth, presence, hands that knew how to make something solid and lasting. She kissed him back with equal conviction, and when they finally separated, her hands were gripping the front of his shirt and his forehead was resting against hers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed saying. Then she stepped back and looked at her trunk. "I need to write to my sister," she said. He looked at the trunk too. "You need to unpack." "I need to do both," she said. "And you need to fix that floorboard." The corner of his mouth curved fully this time, the complete and unguarded version of the expression that had always undone her. "I have been meaning to. For 8 months," she said. "I work at my own pace," he said. She laughed. It was the laugh from the photograph, the one caught from outside the frame, and he stood there for a moment just watching her laugh, and she could see on his face what it cost him to have gone 3 years without letting himself do exactly this. And she made a private decision that she would spend a very long time making certain he knew he never had to cost himself anything like that again. He was at the store the following morning before she was awake, having apparently acquired lumber from somewhere and a new bottle of wood glue. And when she came downstairs at 6 o'clock, the floorboard in her room no longer creaked when she stepped on it. She stood on it for a moment, testing the silence, and found that it made her eyes sting. She wrote to Clara that morning. Clara's reply, when it came 2 weeks later, was several paragraphs of profound relief and 2 sentences of what Bessie privately classified as well-deserved mockery of her sister, for having waited 3 years to arrive at a conclusion that had apparently been visible from Hays, Kansas, without a telescope. Simon came to supper on Sunday evening as usual and stayed later than usual, and they sat on the small porch above the store in the October darkness, talking in a way that was both the same as it had always been and entirely different, because now when she felt the warmth of him beside her in the cold evening air, she did not have to pretend it, was simply the warmth of companionship. Now she could lean against his shoulder and feel his arm come around her and let it be what it was, which was the best thing she had ever felt in her life. He was not suddenly, magically transformed into a man who found words easy. He was still Simon, deliberate and contained and given to long silences that she had learned to read like a second language. But the silences were different now. They were not the silences of a man keeping a wall up. They were the silences of a man who was simply comfortable being in the presence of someone he trusted, which, she understood, was something that Simon Fairchild had not been able to be for a very long time. She asked him about his past on a Sunday in November, when the first hard frost had come, and they were sitting inside by the stove with the lamp lit, and the world reduced to the small, warm circle of the room. She asked quietly and without pressure, and she watched him sit with the question for a long time before he answered. He had grown up in St. Joseph, Missouri. His father had run a hardware business and had been, by Simon's quiet account, a man of volatile temper and considerable pride, a pride that had been Simon's inheritance in ways that Simon did not fully approve of but recognized plainly. His mother had died when he was 12. He had a younger brother named Thomas who had died of fever in 1875 when Simon was 22. He had been engaged once to a woman in St. Joseph named Margaret Dole, and she had broken the engagement 6 weeks before the intended wedding and married a man from Kansas City instead. And Simon had left Missouri 3 months after that and had not been back. He said all of this in the careful, level tone of a man who has made peace with his history but has not forgotten the weight of it. And when he was done, he looked at her with the expression she was coming to think of as his most honest one, the one that was underneath all the others. "I told you about the darkness," he said, "so you would know the shape of what you are taking on." "I already knew the shape," she said. "I have been studying it for 3 years." "I know," he said. "You are thorough." "I am," she agreed and reached across and took his hand. He looked down at her hand over his. His expression did the complicated, slightly astonished thing it sometimes did when something good happened to him, as though he was still in the process of accepting that good things were a category that included him. "Bessie," he said. "Simon," she said. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and it is not impulsive." She looked at him. "All right." He turned his hand over under hers and held it properly, her fingers in his, and he looked at her with the focused clarity that meant he had decided to say a thing and was saying it. "I want to marry you," he said. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because you were leaving and I panicked, but because you are the person I want beside me for the rest of my life, and because I have known that for long enough that I am certain it is true." He paused. "I do not have a ring yet." "I wanted to ask first and get the ring after." "That is unusually practical," she said. "I am an unusually practical man." "Yes," she said, "you are." She looked at him. "Yes, Simon, yes, I will marry you," he exhaled. It was a very small sound, nearly inaudible, but she heard it, and she understood that he had been genuinely uncertain of her answer, and that understanding moved her so deeply that she had to take a breath. "Good," he said. He squeezed her hand. "Good." They were married in the Dusty Creek Church on the 14th of December, 1884, on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snow lay 4 inches deep on the main street, and the whole town came inside to warm themselves on ceremony and goodwill. Reverend Oakes was visibly triumphant. Mrs. Hartwell cried with the enthusiasm of a woman who has invested considerable hope in an outcome, and is gratified to see it arrive. George Pickett gave a toast at the small reception afterward that contained several pointed remarks about the time it had taken to arrive at this occasion, and Simon bore the teasing with a composure that Bessie suspected was costing him something, and she loved him for it. Clara Reed came up from Hayes for the wedding. She was 2 years younger than Bessie, brown-haired and merry, and she shook Simon's hand with the evaluating firmness of a woman who has been hearing about this man for 3 years and intends to form her own opinion. Afterward, when Bessie asked her assessment, Clara had said, "He is exactly what you said. Serious, quiet, deeply in love with you and slightly baffled by his own good fortune." A pause. "I approve." They moved into Simon's claim house 2 miles east of town on the day after the wedding. The house was better than Bessie had expected. He had been building and improving it for 5 years, and it showed. Solidly constructed and tightly sealed against the Nebraska winter, with 3 rooms and a proper kitchen, and worse in some ways, which was to say that 5 years of bachelor occupation had left it with a cheerful disregard for aesthetic consideration. She did not mention this. She simply, over the following weeks and months, made quiet adjustments, and Simon noted them without comment except on one occasion when she rehung a painting that had been sitting on the floor leaning against the wall since apparently before his arrival in Nebraska, and he looked at it on the wall and said, "That is better," in a tone that implied he had always meant to do it and was pleased it had been accomplished. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that Nebraska winters are consistently and impartially hard, and it was also the best winter of Bessie's life. She continued teaching at the Dusty Creek School, making the trip into town each weekday in the small wagon, and Simon continued his building work and his farming, and in the evenings they were together in the solid, warm, lamplit house on the claim, and the simplicity of it was a revelation. She had not known before how much she had wanted exactly this. The particular satisfaction of a life built alongside someone who was genuinely known to you, who had no performance for you, who moved through the shared space of daily life with the full weight of themselves. In February of 1885, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday evening while he was mending a piece of harness by the stove. He went very still in the way he went still when something hit him with force. Then he set the harness down on the floor and looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was underneath all the others, the honest one, and it was doing something she had never quite seen it do before, something that she could only describe as awe. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, the top of her head, her forehead again, and then held her against him with his arms around her and his chin on her hair and said nothing at all for a long time. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong and a little fast. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could feel the answer through the whole length of him. "Yes," he said. "God, yes. Bessie, yes." Their son was born in October of 1885, after a labor that lasted most of a Thursday and into the early hours of Friday morning, with Mrs. Hartwell in attendance as midwife and Simon pacing the kitchen floor with a regularity that wore a visible track in the boards and would, Bessie later informed him, need to be addressed before winter. The baby arrived at 4 in the morning, announced himself to the world with considerable vocal conviction, and was placed in his father's arms while Bessie, exhausted and deeply satisfied, watched Simon Fairchild hold his firstborn son. There was a look on his face that she had never seen there before and would never forget. It was not the controlled, measured expression of a man deciding whether to show himself. It was entirely open. It was wonder and terror, and a love so complete that it appeared to have temporarily removed his ability to function, and he stood there holding this new, furious, extraordinary small person, with the kind of reverence that she had previously only observed in him when he was working on something he considered genuinely important. They named him Thomas William Fairchild. Thomas for Simon's brother, William for Bessie's father. He had Simon's dark hair and Bessie's wide eyes, and from the first week he demonstrated that he had inherited the best qualities of both his parents. His father's stubborn, focused intensity, and his mother's implacable cheerfulness. The years that followed were the years of building. Building the farm, Simon added a second barn in 1886 and a proper root cellar in 1887, and fenced the east pasture in 1888. Building the family, a daughter they named Rose Ellen arrived in the spring of 1887, round and rosy and temperamentally inclined toward getting her own way, which made her approximately her father's daughter in the deepest sense. Building the life of the town itself, because Dusty Creek was growing in those years, slowly and steadily in the way of the western Nebraska settlements, and Simon's building skills were increasingly in demand as new families arrived, and the community that had been 8 buildings expanded toward something more permanent. Bessie continued teaching. She taught the children of the families who came through and stayed, and some of the children of families who came through and left, and she taught a reading and arithmetic class one evening a week for adults who wanted it, which drew 6 to 10 people depending on the season. She was the kind of teacher her students remembered. She knew this not from any immodesty but from the evidence. The adults who had been her students continued to seek her out years later, the way people seek out the people who gave them a particular kind of useful gift. In the spring of 1888, something happened that shook the settled comfort of their life without quite breaking it. A man arrived in Dusty Creek on a May afternoon. He was lean and road-worn, arriving on a horse that had been ridden hard and inadequately fed, and he gave his name at the Copper Nail Saloon as James Cutler. He stayed for 3 days, drinking moderately and talking little, and on the 3rd day he appeared at the door of the Dusty Creek Land Office and made inquiries about the Fairchild claim. George Pickett, who had known Simon since before Bessie arrived and was constitutionally incapable of withholding information that might be useful to a friend, told Simon about it that same afternoon. Simon's face went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Bessie noticed it at supper. "What is it?" she asked. "A man came to the land office asking about the claim," he said. He moved his fork. "His name is James Cutler." She watched him. "Do you know him?" "I knew a Cutler in Missouri," he said. "A family. James would be the youngest." He paused. "There was some unfinished business between my family and the Cutlers, my father's doing mostly, a bad debt, a bad transaction. My father was not always honest in his business affairs." He said this plainly and without softness. "I left Missouri before it was fully resolved. I did not know they would follow it this far." "What does he want?" "I do not know yet." He set his fork down. "I intend to find out." He found out the following morning, by the simple method of going to the Copper Nail and sitting across a table from James Cutler with a cup of coffee and asking directly. He came home in the late afternoon and sat down at the kitchen table and told Bessie what Cutler had said. The Cutler family believed that Simon's father had defrauded James's father of $200 in a business arrangement that had gone wrong, and that the elder Fairchild had died before making it right, and that the debt had passed to Simon as the surviving son. James Cutler had not come to cause trouble. He had come because he had been told that Simon Fairchild was a man who would honor a legitimate debt, and because the Cutler family needed the money, and because $200 in 1888 was a sum worth traveling for. Simon looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Bessie. "Was your father's debt legitimate?" she asked. "I believe so," he said. "I had no way to know for certain. I knew my father was not honest in his dealings, and I knew the Cutlers had been among the people he had dealt with badly. I just did not know the details." He paused. "I have the money. I earned it separately from anything of his I have been saving." "Then pay it," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "Yes," he said, "I will." He paid James Cutler the $200 the following morning. Cutler, who had apparently been prepared for a harder fight, shook Simon's hand with a sincerity that suggested genuine relief, and left Dusty Creek on the afternoon of the same day, heading south toward Kansas. Bessie watched the transaction from the doorway of the general store. She had business with Mrs. Hartwell that morning, and had made no effort to arrange otherwise. And she watched the handshake and the departure, and then turned to find Mrs. Hartwell beside her. "That is a good man," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I know," said Bessie. The incident passed like a brief, clarifying storm, leaving the air cleaner behind it. Simon did not speak of his father again for years, and when he did it was with the equanimity of a man who has made peace with something difficult, not by pretending it was not difficult, but by determining that it would not define him. Bessie had always loved him for his competence and his steadiness, and the warmth he kept carefully controlled, and the intelligence of his dark eyes. She found that she loved him additionally, in the aftermath of the Cutler affair, for his bone-deep integrity, which was not the easy integrity of a man who has never been tested, but the harder kind, the kind built deliberately in reaction to a model he had rejected. The summer of 1889 brought a drought that tested every farm in Comanche County. The Fairchild claim survived it better than most because Simon had planned the water systems well, and because Bessie had the practical common sense to reduce the household's consumption early and keep reducing it. They helped where they could, sharing what they had surplus of, and the community that had been growing in the good years held together with greater strength than it might have in the difficult one. Bessie organized a shared harvest for 3 families whose crops had come in too thin for one household to handle alone, and Simon and two other men from the county spent a week repairing the small irrigation channel that fed several claims east of town, working in the August heat with the focused efficiency of men who understood that the work was necessary and the conversation could wait. In September of 1889, Nebraska was granted statehood. It had been a state since 1867, but the particular autumn of 1889 brought a new wave of settlement and the energy of a country in the middle of actively, urgently making itself, and Dusty Creek, which had been growing steadily, began to grow faster. 2 new families arrived in September alone. By the end of the year, there were 43 children enrolled in the school, which was more than a single teacher could reasonably manage. And Bessie raised the question at the town council meeting in December with a statistical thoroughness that left the council with no comfortable alternative but to allocate funds for a second teacher. The second teacher arrived in the spring of 1890, a young woman from Omaha named Dorothy Chase, 22 years old and freshly graduated from the Nebraska State Normal School, who arrived with a carpetbag and a determination that reminded Bessie strongly of herself at 24, stepping off a train in a new country. Bessie took Dorothy under her practical wing with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has been helped and understands the value of it, and Dorothy proved to be an excellent teacher and a genuine friend, which was a combination Bessie had not realized she was missing until she had it. The house on the Fairchild claim continued to grow. Simon added a 4th room in the spring of 1890. The children were sharing a room, and Thomas, now 4, had begun to register his objections to this arrangement with increasing firmness. And in the autumn of 1890, they converted the back porch into a proper sitting room, which gave Bessie a space she had been quietly wanting since the first winter, a room with enough light for reading and enough space for the piano that Mrs. Hartwell, who was getting elderly and whose hands were not what they had been, had given them on the grounds that it deserved to be played. Bessie played the piano in the evenings. Simon, who had no particular musical talent, had the capacity for genuine listening that certain people possess, the ability to give a piece of music their full attention without performing appreciation, and she found that playing for an audience of Simon was one of the better pleasures of her daily life. Rose, at 3 and then 4, developed an interest in the piano that was already outlasting mere novelty. Thomas preferred to climb things, which was a preference that earned him several splinters and one memorable afternoon in June of 1890, when he climbed the new barn roof and declined to come down until Bessie reasoned him to the edge, and Simon caught him with a competence that suggested he had been expecting this particular emergency. "He is your son," Bessie told Simon that evening, when Thomas was in bed and the house was quiet. Simon looked at her with perfect composure. "In which sense do you mean that?" "The sense in which he commits fully to a course of action and then will not admit it was a bad one." "Ah," said Simon, "yes, he is my son in that sense." "You are both going to give me gray hair," she said. "You would still be beautiful," he said, in the plain, direct tone he used for the most important things, and she threw a pillow at him, which he caught without effort. The 1890s arrived. The country was changing around them, and the changes were not all comfortable. The drought of 1889 had been the beginning of a difficult agricultural cycle that would not fully resolve for years, and many of the homesteading families who had arrived in the optimistic 1880s found themselves in real hardship. Bessie watched this with the close attention of a woman who had grown up knowing exactly how thin the margin could be for ordinary families, and she did what she could in the way of practical assistance, extending credit at the school's material supply, organizing the community dinners that became a regular fixture of the town's social life, teaching the evening classes with increased frequency as more people sought additional skills. Simon's building work became increasingly important to the family's income, as the farm income was squeezed by the drought years. He was not only building in Dusty Creek now, but in Hartwell Junction and 2 other nearby settlements, traveling sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a stretch to work on a commission, and Bessie managed the claim in his absences with the competence she had always had and a quiet efficiency that had been sharpened by 6 years of running a household and raising 2 children and teaching 40 students. She missed him when he was away. This was not a small or manageable thing. She had discovered in 6 years of marriage that she was more dependent on his presence than she had anticipated, not in the helpless way, not in the way of a woman who could not function without a man, because she functioned very well and he knew it, and had never expected otherwise, but in the deeper way, the way of a person who has become genuinely accustomed to having their favorite company available and finds the absence of it leaves the days slightly thinner. He knew this. He came home from every trip with the particular focused attention of a man reminding himself of what he was returning to, and the first evening back in the house had a quality that she had come to treasure: the realignment of themselves, the falling back into the rhythm of the shared life, the conversation that picked up the thread dropped at departure and continued without seam. In the autumn of 1891, she found she was expecting again, their third child. This news arrived during one of his absences. He was in Hartwell Junction for a week completing a commission on a new stable, and she waited until his return to tell him, sitting across the kitchen table on a Thursday evening with the children in bed and the lamp lit. He heard her out and was still for a moment and then reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am, in fact, rather happy about it." "Good," he said. He turned her hand over in his. "So am I." He looked up at her. "I should stay closer to home for a while." "You do not have to." "I want to," he said, in the tone that closed the matter. Their second son was born in the spring of 1892. They named him Henry James Fairchild. Henry for no particular reason except that Bessie had always liked it, and James because Simon, somewhat to her surprise, said he wanted to use the name as a small, private acknowledgement of the Cutler debt he had settled, and the version of himself he was determined to be, the version that paid what was owed and walked cleanly. She had looked at him when he said this and thought, as she had thought many times in their 7 years together, that the man he had built himself into was more impressive than any building he had ever constructed. Henry proved to be an easy baby, calm and observant, with a quality of watchful attention that Bessie recognized from his father, and that was both endearing and occasionally unnerving in a person who was, at 6 months, significantly shorter than a fence post. The children grew. Thomas became a serious, focused boy who was interested in the mechanical workings of everything, and who followed his father around building sites with an intensity of attention that Simon bore with patience, and eventually began to meet with explanation. Rose was bright and willful and had a laugh that could fill a room, and she was the child who most easily broke through the remaining reserve of Simon's public manner, because he was constitutionally unable to be contained when Rose directed her full force at him, which she did with the strategic precision of a person who has identified the most effective approach and uses it without apology. Henry, as he grew past babyhood into a small person with opinions, proved to be the most thoughtful of the three, the one who watched and processed before acting, who asked questions that required genuine answers, who at 4 years old would sit beside his father in the evening and look at whatever Simon was looking at with a quality of shared attention that had, the first time Bessie observed it, made her throat tight with something that was too large and too good for a simple name. In 1893, the financial panic that struck the country hit Nebraska's agricultural communities hard, and the years that followed were lean ones. The Fairchild claim got through them on Simon's building income and Bessie's teaching salary and the combined resources of careful management and productive acreage. They did not go without. They were luckier than many. But the hardship around them was real, and it asked things of the community: patience, cooperation, the practical solidarity of people who understood that the margin between one family's survival and another's might come down to nothing more than a cord of shared firewood, or a bucket of flour given without record keeping. And Bessie gave what she could and watched Simon do the same. In 1895, Dusty Creek got its first newspaper, a 4-page weekly called the Dusty Creek Courier, run by a man named Albert Marsh who had arrived from Chicago with a printing press and a great deal of opinion and no particular knowledge of agriculture. Bessie found him interesting and occasionally infuriating and wrote 2 letters to the paper in its first year correcting matters of fact, and Marsh printed both letters with a respectful note about the quality of the correspondence, and they became, somewhat improbably, friends. The paper was a signal of permanence. So was the new school building that opened in 1896, a proper 2-room brick structure with large windows and a bell tower, built by, among others, Simon Fairchild, who donated 6 weeks of his time to the project at a reduced rate that was really closer to no rate, and who stood at the opening ceremony in November of 1896 with his hat in his hands and his family beside him and was, Bessie thought, as close to visibly proud as she had ever seen him in public. She leaned close to him. "This is fine work," she said quietly. "The brickwork on the east wall is slightly off," he said, equally quietly. "You can see it if you know where to look." "I am choosing not to know where to look," she said. He looked at her sideways. Good policy. She was 39 years old. She had been in Dusty Creek for 14 years and married for 12, and she felt the particular deep satisfaction of a life that had become what she had hoped it might be when she was a young woman with a carpetbag and a firm jaw stepping off a train onto a platform where a dark-haired, self-contained man had been waiting to collect her. Not because the life was easy or simple or without cost, but because it was hers, built by her choices and his, built together out of the daily materials of hard country and honest work and the willingness to be known. Thomas was 11 years old in 1896 and already taller than his mother. Rose was 9, and in her first year of serious piano instruction, which she took from Bessie herself with a ferocious work ethic that pleased her teacher and delighted her father. Henry was 4, walking alongside his father on building site visits with the careful attention of someone taking notes. Simon was 43. The dark hair had gray in it now at the temples and at the edges of his jaw, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the western sun, and his hands were even more callous than they had been 12 years earlier, and he was, in Bessie's considered view, the best-looking man she had ever seen, which she had told him on several occasions, and which he had received with the slightly baffled gratitude of a man who has never been entirely certain how to accept being seen clearly and still found pleasing. He still did not find words easy. He was still Simon, still the man who communicated in presence and action and the careful, deliberate choices of a person for whom every selection was intentional. But the wall was long since down. Had been down since the afternoon he stood in her doorway with the floorboard complaining under his weight and his hands at his sides, and his pride laid out on the floor, and said the hardest, most necessary thing he had ever said. She had watched him, over the 12 years of their marriage, become gradually more fluent in the language of feeling, not because he had changed his fundamental nature, but because safety made expansion possible, because being fully known and fully accepted by one person had, slowly, incrementally, given him permission to be more of himself in every direction. He still sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway on a winter evening and watched her at the piano with an expression that he thought she could not see from where she sat. But she had a mirror placed deliberately on the far wall, angled to catch exactly that spot, and she had been watching that expression for 12 years, and it was still, every time, sufficient to make her lose her place in whatever she was playing. She never told him about the mirror. Some things were better kept. The new century arrived without ceremony, which was to say that Dusty Creek celebrated it with a gathering at the Copper Nail and a certain amount of general noise. And Simon and Bessie attended and drank a glass of the decent champagne that Albert Marsh had somehow acquired from Omaha, and stood with their shoulders touching, and their children at home with Mrs. Hartwell, who had become something between a grandmother and a fixture of the family's life. And when the clock in the bar reached midnight and the year turned, Simon turned to her and said, "A new century." "Yes," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about the question seriously, as she did with his questions, because he asked them seriously. She felt the weight of the past years, the good ones and the hard ones, the building and the pruning, the children sleeping safe in the house on the claim, the school across the street with her handprints on it, the man beside her who had stood in her doorway 33 years younger and been, finally, brave enough to say the thing she had packed slowly to give him time to find. "Good," she said. "I feel very good about it." He looked at her. He was 47 now and she was 43, and the years were in both their faces in the way they accumulate in people who have lived outdoors and raised children and worked hard, and it was fine. It was all fine. It was the face she wanted to look at for every remaining year of her life. "So do I," he said. He raised his glass. "To Dusty Creek." "To Dusty Creek," she said, and they drank and the new century began. Thomas Fairchild graduated from the Dusty Creek School in the spring of 1901. At 16, the oldest student in the school's history, by virtue of being the most stubborn about staying through the full curriculum that his mother had constructed for the upper years. He announced his intention to study engineering in Lincoln at the Nebraska State University, a plan that had apparently been forming in him for years without announcement, which was so completely consistent with the way his father operated that Bessie could only observe it with resigned admiration. Simon drove Thomas to the train station at Hartwell Junction on a morning in September of 1901, and Bessie came with them, and the three of them stood on the platform in the early autumn light with the particular formal feeling of a moment that is marking itself in real time. Thomas shook his father's hand with the seriousness of a young man who is trying to communicate something larger than the gesture can contain, and Simon held the handshake for a moment, and then put his other hand briefly on his son's shoulder, and something passed between them that Bessie could see without being able to name, which was all right, because some things between fathers and sons belong only to them. Thomas boarded the train. He leaned out the window as it began to move and waved once, with the characteristic Fairchild economy of gesture, and then disappeared inside, and Bessie and Simon stood on the platform until the train was out of sight. On the drive home she put her hand through his arm and he covered her hand with his. "He is going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "He is more capable than he knows." "He knows," she said. "He gets it from you." Simon drove. The road was good in the September morning, the fields golden and the sky enormous in the Nebraska way, the way that could still make her catch her breath after 20 years of living under it. "Are you sad?" she asked. He considered this. "Some," he said, "and proud." "Mostly proud." "Me too," she said. Rose was 14 that year, deep in her piano playing, and in the particular intensity of a young woman who was just beginning to understand her own intelligence, which was considerable. She was going to be a teacher, she had announced at 12, with the certainty of a person who knows their own direction, and Bessie had felt a complicated joy at this, the kind that is partly pure pride and partly the specific gratitude of a woman who knows what it means to do work that matters. Henry was 9 and curious about everything, especially the sky. He had developed a fascination with the night sky that had led to the acquisition of a small telescope, a birthday gift from Bessie and Simon in 1901, purchased from a catalog at not inconsiderable expense, and that telescope had led to a steady correspondence with a professor at the University of Nebraska who ran an amateur astronomy network, and who responded to Henry's careful, detailed letters with genuine intellectual engagement. Simon read those letters sometimes, the professor's responses, and Bessie caught him looking at them with the expression of a man absorbing something unexpected and good, and she understood that he was discovering his son's particular shape of mind, and finding it marvelous. The early 1900s brought Dusty Creek into a new period. The railroad had pushed through the county in 1898, and the connection to the larger world had transformed the town's economy and its character. The 8 buildings of 1882 had become 32. The population had grown from approximately 100 people to nearly 400. There was now a proper hotel, a second general store, a doctor's office with a real doctor in it, and a school that had outgrown even the brick building of 1896 and was in the process of expanding. Simon built the expansion. He was 50 in 1903, and he built the expansion with the same focused, meticulous care he had brought to the original building in 1896. And when it was done, and the children filed into the new rooms on a September morning, Bessie stood in the hallway and felt the accumulated weight of 20 years of teaching in this community settle into something that was not heaviness but ballast, the good kind, the kind that keeps you from being blown off course. She taught until the spring of 1905, when Dorothy Chase, who had been teaching alongside her for 15 years, and who was by now as much a fixture of the school as the brick walls themselves, told her gently and with great affection that the school board was prepared to offer a full director's position to Bessie, which would mean less classroom time and more oversight of the curriculum and the other teachers, and that this was something Bessie had earned 100 times over. Bessie thought about it for a week. She talked to Simon about it on a Sunday evening in March with the spring light still coming through the new sitting room windows, and Simon listened and then said, with the directness she had always valued, "What do you want?" "I want to keep teaching," she said, "but I want the curriculum work too. I have been doing it informally for years." "Then take the position," he said, "and keep teaching the classes that matter most to you. You think the board will accommodate that?" "You have built this school for 20 years," he said. "They will accommodate whatever you propose." He was right. The board accommodated it. Bessie became the school director in September of 1905, 48 years old, with her name on the door and her curriculum in every classroom and her voice in every decision and her hands still, every day, in the chalk dust of the subject she loved most, which was reading, always reading, the endless generous capacity of words to build a person's interior world into something larger and stronger and more inhabitable than it was before. Thomas came home from Lincoln in the summer of 1905 with his engineering qualification and a young woman named Helen Marsh, who was Albert Marsh's daughter and who had apparently been making very good use of her proximity to the person her father had been printing news about for a decade. Bessie liked Helen immediately. She was practical and warm and had her father's intelligence and none of his tendency toward overstatement. Simon, who took longer to form opinions but formed them accurately, gave his measured verdict after the first week. "She is good for him." Thomas and Helen were married in Dusty Creek in October of 1905, in the same church where Bessie and Simon had been married 21 years earlier, with Reverend Oakes, who was 73 and using a cane but had refused retirement, officiating with the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched the children he married grow into parents of marriageable children. At the reception, Bessie danced with Simon as she had first danced with him in Hartwell Junction 22 years earlier, and he was still, impossibly, a better dancer than anyone expected, and she told him so, and he said, "You say that every time," and she said, "because it surprises me every time." And he smiled, the full, unguarded version, the one that had always been worth the wait. In 1906, Rose Fairchild began teaching at the Dusty Creek School, joining her mother on the faculty with an energy and a capability that made Bessie's pride absolutely unreasonable. Rose was 19, formally trained in Omaha, deeply competent, and had inherited her father's focused intensity in such concentration that her students, most of whom were terrified of her in the productive sense, learned at a rate that kept Bessie quietly, immodestly delighted. Henry turned 14 in 1906 and was the kind of student who made teaching feel like genuine collaboration, the kind where the teacher learned something in the course of instruction. He was going to the university in Lincoln the following year. It was already decided. It had the quality of something that was simply going to happen rather than being planned. And Bessie prepared for his departure with the equanimity of a woman who had already done this once and who knew, from long experience, that the children who leave well are the ones you raised right. Simon turned 53 in 1906. He had begun to transfer more of the heavy construction work to his younger crew, men he had trained himself over the years, keeping for himself the design work and the carpentry and the consulting, the work that used his precision and his problem-solving without requiring the pure physical output of his younger decades. He had the body of a man who had used it hard for 30 years and who felt that clearly in the mornings, though he would not have said so directly if asked. Bessie knew because she knew him, the small adjustments, the way he moved in the first hour of cold days, the careful economy of motion that was new in the past few years. She said nothing about it directly. She simply ensured that the kitchen stove was lit earlier on cold mornings and adjusted the time at which she suggested coffee, and changed nothing about her behavior toward him in any way that could be construed as accommodation, because Simon Fairchild at 53 would no more accept being accommodated for physical limitations than he would have accepted it at 30. But she could manage circumstances. She had always been good at that. He noticed. He noticed everything. He said nothing about it for 3 months, and then one morning at the kitchen table he looked at her over his coffee and said, "The stove." She said. "You light it early now." She met his eyes. She kept her expression pleasant. "The mornings have been colder," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something crossed his face, the thing she recognized as gratitude that did not know how to speak, which was still, after 22 years, one of the most moving things she had ever seen, and he looked back down at his coffee. "Yes," he said, "they have." And that was all. Henry went to Lincoln in the autumn of 1907 and was absorbed by the university with the efficiency of an institution that recognizes its own. He was 17 and self-possessed and wrote home every 2 weeks with letters that were detailed and funny and warm, and Bessie kept every one of them in a box in the sitting room that already held Thomas's early letters and would eventually hold roses from wherever her life took her. The house on the claim was quiet in the evenings without the children in it, and the quietness had a different quality than the silence of the early years before them. It was the silence of sufficiency, of a life that has arrived at itself, and Bessie found that she was not sad in it. She had expected to be more sad. Instead, she found that she was, with more time and fewer competing demands, more present to the specific pleasure of the life she had built, more attentive to the simple satisfaction of evenings with Simon in the sitting room, she at the piano or with a book, he with his drawings or his carpentry, or simply sitting with the quality of rest that belonged to men who have worked very hard for a very long time. They walked in the evenings when the weather permitted, out along the east fence and back, a walk that took 20 minutes and that they had been taking together since the first year of their marriage. And they talked, and did not talk in the easy, unguarded way of people who have been in each other's company for decades, and have no need to perform attention or interest because the attention and interest are simply there, as much a part of them as breathing. On a spring evening in 1909, they were on this walk when Bessie stopped at the east fence and looked at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary with the light, the kind of sunset that the Nebraska panhandle produced occasionally, an event of color that demanded the whole horizon and used it extravagantly. "Look at that," she said. Simon stopped beside her and looked. They stood in silence for a minute or two while the color changed and intensified and then began to soften toward evening. "Henry would name all of those," she said, meaning the colors. "He would," Simon agreed. He looked at the sky. "Rose would try to play it," Bessie laughed. "She would. And she would probably succeed. Thomas would calculate the atmospheric refraction. He would calculate it," she agreed, "and then find the structural inefficiency in the horizon and propose an improvement." Simon made the sound that meant he was genuinely amused. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I was thinking that this is the best thing I have ever built." She understood that he did not mean the fence or the claim house or the school or any of the structures that were the external record of his life's work. She understood what he meant. "You did not build it alone," she said. "No," he said. "I had an excellent partner." "You did," she said. "She is extraordinary." "She is," he said. He reached out and took her hand. She packed slowly. "I am grateful for it." She looked at him. The evening light was gold and the sky was still doing its extravagant thing, and his hand was warm around hers, and she was 52 years old and she had been in love with this man for 27 years, longer than any other single fact of her adult life. "I knew you would find the words eventually," she said. "I needed time," he said. "You needed consequence," she corrected. "That too," he admitted. He turned back to the sunset. "I am glad you gave it to me." They walked back to the house in the last of the evening light, hands linked, and behind them the Nebraska sky completed its performance and settled into the deep blue of full dusk, and the claim house windows were warm with lamplight ahead of them. And it was, by any measure that Bessie Reed Fairchild knew how to apply, a good and whole and completely sufficient life. Thomas and Helen had their first child in 1910. A son named Simon James Fairchild, named for his grandfather with a precision of tribute that made the elder Simon sit very still for a moment when he heard it, and then look out the window for a while. Bessie watched him receiving this with the same quality of awed, uncertain gratitude she had seen on his face the night their first son was born, and she thought about the man who had arrived in St. Joseph, Missouri, in some year before she knew him, carrying the inheritance of a difficult father and a string of losses, and had built himself into this man whose grandson bore his name because his son had chosen to honor him. She went and stood beside him at the window, and he put his arm around her without looking away from whatever he was looking at, and she leaned into his side, and they stood there in Thomas and Helen's new house in Dusty Creek and were grandparents for the first time, and it was, she thought, the next entirely new and good thing. Rose, at 23, was as committed to her independence as to her teaching, and she had informed the family on a summer evening in 1910 that she was not interested in the particular social pressure applied to young women toward marriage, and that she planned to continue teaching, and intended to complete a formal degree from the Nebraska State Normal School over the next 2 years, and that this was the direction of her life, and she was quite settled about it. Simon had listened to this declaration with his full, undivided attention, and then said, "Good," in a tone that conveyed absolute support and not a trace of anything else, and Bessie had looked at him with a love so complete it was almost painful, because that single word had been exactly the right one, and he had known it. Henry returned from Lincoln in 1912 with his degree in natural sciences and an appointment at the university's astronomy department as a junior research associate, which meant he would be in Lincoln and not in Dusty Creek, which meant that the last of the children had gone to their own lives. Bessie and Simon drove to Hartwell Junction for Henry's farewell in August of 1912, and the platform scene had the quality of a deliberate echo of Thomas's departure 11 years earlier, and Henry shook his father's hand with the same serious gravity, and Simon put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder in the same gesture, and Bessie thought that some things in families are passed forward not through words, but through the body's own language, the touch that means what words are not enough to say. Henry, boarding the train, turned and looked back at them standing on the platform, the way Thomas had turned and looked back 11 years before, and something passed across his face that was the expression of a young man who has been loved well and knows it, which is one of the most valuable things a person can carry into the world. He turned and went aboard. The train took him south toward Lincoln. Bessie and Simon stood on the platform until it was out of sight, and then Simon said, "Well," which was his entire summary of the occasion, and she squeezed his arm and they walked to the wagon. "Empty nesters," she said when they were on the road home. "It was always going to come," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you sad?" "Some," he said in the same tone he had used 11 years before when Thomas had left, and proud, mostly proud, he glanced at her, "and glad to have you to myself," she smiled. "You have always been somewhat possessive." "No," he said, "I have always known what I had. There is a distinction." "That," she said, "is one of the more romantic things you have ever said to me." "I am getting better at it," he said. "You are," she agreed. "Only 30 years in." He gave her the sideways look. She laughed. The years that followed were the particular richness of a life in its later season, the years when the compounding of everything that has been planted and tended begins to show itself in full. Thomas's engineering work expanded. Rose completed her degree and became the head of the Dusty Creek School's lower division, filling the role with the focused intensity of a person doing exactly the work they were made for. Henry published his first paper on stellar observation in 1914, and when the university newspaper wrote a brief notice about it, Albert Marsh's successor at the Dusty Creek Courier ran the same notice with visible local pride, and Bessie cut it out and added it to the box with the letters. Simon turned 60 in 1913, and the town of Dusty Creek held a gathering in his honor, not a formal ceremony, because Simon Fairchild would not have attended a formal ceremony in his honor, but a gathering at the schoolhouse in early November that was nominally a town meeting, and that was, in the first 20 minutes, revealed to be something else by the presence of the banner that Rose had made and Thomas had hung, and Henry had come back from Lincoln specifically to witness. Simon looked at the banner and at his assembled family, and at the 40 or 50 people who had come to mark, in the practical, understated way of small Western communities, the 60 years of a man they had found to be, over 30 years of acquaintance, what Mrs. Hartwell had said he was on the day Bessie arrived. A good man, not an easy one. He made a speech of approximately 4 sentences, which was, the general consensus held, perfectly appropriate. Bessie made no speech at all. She sat beside him at the table they had been given at the front of the room and held his hand under the table where no one could see it, and he squeezed it once without looking at her, and she was so completely happy that the room seemed full of light. They were home by 9 o'clock. The children settled in various houses in and around Dusty Creek for the night, the claim house quiet and warm in the November darkness. Simon sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and Bessie sat across from him, and the lamp was between them, and 31 years of shared life were in the room as tangible as furniture. "Did you like it?" she asked. "I did not dislike it," he said. "That is a ringing endorsement." "It was a good evening," he said. He looked at her. "You organized it." "Rose organized it," she said. "I contributed logistical support." "You always do," he said. He set his cup down. "Bessie." "Simon," she said, "I want to say something." She waited. "I have not been for most of my life a man who said things that needed saying," he said. He looked at his hands on the table. "I am aware that this is accurate and that it cost you something in the early years before I found my way to it." He looked up. "I am grateful that you packed slowly. I am grateful that you gave me time to find the words. And I want you to know that every word I have found in the 30 years since has been yours. Every good thing that came after that afternoon was yours." He paused. "I am saying this directly because it is true and because you deserve to hear it said directly." Bessie Reed Fairchild, 56 years old, sat in the kitchen of the house on the claim in the November darkness and felt the full weight and warmth of 30 years press into her chest like sunlight. "You found the words," she said. "You have been finding them every day since then." "Slowly," he said. "At your own pace," she said and smiled. He reached across the table and took her hand. He held it the way he had always held it, her fingers in his calloused, capable, good hands that had built everything that surrounded them. "At my own pace," he agreed. The corner of his mouth moved into the full, unguarded version of the expression she had been watching for 30 years. "Which has always been enough for you." "Always," she said. "From the first summer." Outside, the Nebraska November did its dark and windswept business with magnificent indifference, and inside the lamp burned low and the coffee cooled, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, because everything that needed saying had been said, and they were home. Thomas and Helen had a second child in 1915, a daughter named Bessie Clara Fairchild, named for her grandmother and her grandmother's sister. And the naming arrived in a letter that Thomas brought out to the claim on a December afternoon with Helen beside him and the new baby in his arms. And when Simon and Bessie read the letter, Thomas having put it in a letter because he was, in this as in all things, his father's son, Bessie looked up at her husband and saw that his eyes were bright. He was not going to make mention of that. She was not going to make mention of that. It was, between them, simply known. They sat in the sitting room that winter afternoon, Simon and Bessie and Thomas and Helen, and the two grandchildren. Little Simon James, now 5 and full of his father's same unstoppable focus, and baby Bessie Clara, sleeping in her grandmother's arms with the complete confidence of a person who is exactly where she ought to be. And Rose came in from the school with snow on her coat, and Henry came down from his brief winter visit from Lincoln. And the house was full of the family that had grown out of an afternoon 31 years earlier, when a man had been too proud to ask a woman to stay, and the woman had packed slowly and given him the time to find his way to the words. And he had found them, and they had built everything from there. The fire in the parlor stove gave off its steady warmth, and the snow came down on the Nebraska panhandle in the clean, impartial way of December snow, and the lamp in the sitting room window burned yellow gold against the white, visible for a distance, a signal that said, here is a house, here is the warmth of people who know each other, coming out of the cold. Bessie Fairchild looked around the room at the faces she loved most in the world, and felt the absolute, closed completeness of a life that had arrived at exactly what it was supposed to be, and she was grateful, down to the last particular of herself, for every year of it, including the years before the beginning, including the packed trunk and the train ticket and the afternoon light through the window of the room above the general store, including the moment she had turned around and seen him in the doorway with everything showing on his face for once, with the wall down and his pride on the floor and 3 years of held-back love finally ready to be spoken. She had packed slowly. She had given him the time, and he had found the words, and the words had been the beginning of everything.